Hello, welcome to the debate. I'm Kaveh Takbai. Condemnations continue to pour in against Israeli annexation plans. The latest has come from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who has said that this will be disastrous, with its consequences to be felt for decades. What types of consequences is she referring to? We will be asking our guests that very same question, and whether Israel will ultimately go ahead with its annexation plan. We'll also question whether the Europeans will proceed with sanctions against Israel, something that they have threatened to do. First, let's get an update about this from Mona Kandil, a correspondent who joins us from occupied Ramallah. Well, Mona, at this point, the accusations keep coming, or not the accusations, but condemnations. The latest from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. Tell us how that's sitting with Palestinians, and if you have any word from the Palestinian officials about the annexation.
Well, the Palestinians insist that all settlements in the occupied West Bank are illegal, and the annexation of these settlements and the Jordan Valley, of course, should be faced with serious positions from the international community and the Arab countries as well. Now, the Israeli regime will hold a cabinet vote on July the 1st in order to decide on the annexation. Netanyahu and his rival Benny Gantz, the former military minister, still didn't have a joint position on how the Israeli regime would be annexing this 30% of the occupied West Bank. The Israelis called on the American administration for full support. However, the Americans informed Netanyahu that Netanyahu and Gantz should agree on how the annexation would take place. Netanyahu, at the same time, is a little bit worried. He doesn't want for violence to be carried out in the occupied territories. At the same time, he didn't get the full support of the American administration, the green light to go ahead. This is why experts are expecting that Netanyahu might not go ahead with the annexation of the 30% of the occupied West Bank. However, he will start annexing the major settlement blocks like Ma'ale Adumim and Gush Atzion, those illegal settlements and major ones around Jerusalem, Al-Quds. Palestinians are still demanding the international community for a serious position, and they insist that they will not remain silent. They will stay united in facing this Israeli illegal policy.
Thank you very much for that. Mona Kandil, correspondent there from occupied Ramallah. Let me introduce author of Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire, Richard Becker, who joins us from San Francisco. Richard Becker, welcome. Another UN condemnation. We heard from the UN chief himself days ago, and now we have the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, saying, quote, annexation is illegal, period. Any annexation, whether it is 30% of the West Bank or 5%. What do you think of her statements there and the sincerity behind what she's saying?
Well, the statements, there's no question that. But the real issue is, will any action be taken by the United Nations? Because what Israel has going for it is, of course, the power of the United States. Israel is kind of a protectorate of the United States, protected against international opinion, not completely absent from that, but largely able to go on its own way because of the power of the United States and the protection that it affords to the state of Israel, along with the vast, the diplomatic protection, along with the vast military aid, $3.8 billion per year, and it's actually, I think, more than that. We have the statements that are coming from Human Rights and UN Security Council and the Secretary General of the United Nations and Michelle Bachelet and all these people, but what will the impact really be? It's very hard to see what it will be. The really vital question is what is going to happen in the West Bank and Gaza and among the Palestinian people.
Okay, let me introduce Tony Gosling from Bristol. He's an investigative journalist who joins us. Tony Gosling, welcome. Continuing with what Michelle Bachelet has said, and so I can get a reaction from you, she has said for Netanyahu to, quote, listen to its own former senior officials and generals, as well as to the multitude of voices around the world, warning it not to proceed along this dangerous path. You know, when she makes statements like that, you wonder whether Israel would even be taking that seriously when throughout multiple wars, children were being killed, and Israel continued with this war on Gaza in reference to the Gaza wars. Do you think this time around is different?
Well, no. I think we need to understand just exactly who and what Netanyahu is. He is actually a former person in the special forces. So basically, they have been state-sponsored terrorists in the past. This is the kind of person that he is. And I mean, a lot of people are scratching their heads. I mean, I'm afraid I gave up scratching my head many years ago after I met a guy called Alan who used to work for the BBC and ITV, and he wrote a book called Zionism, the Real Enemy of the Jews, which was a fascinating 2 massive volumes. And he had been working for the BBC and ITV News, covering the Middle East and particularly the Israel-Palestine problems, really right the way through the 1960s, 70s and 80s. And he explained to me, look, the Israelis actually want a war. This is the explanation for everything. And ultimately, they want to create a conflict which is going to drag in the United States as their ally in order to support them in the Middle East. And this has been borne out, really, with the wars that we've seen since Alan was working as an internationally renowned TV journalist. He knew various of the Israeli prime ministers, for example. And after the 9/11 attacks, what we saw was the US actually doing regime changes in all of the main countries, or many of the main countries, where Israel wanted them. For example, in Syria, an attempt to regime change. There's been all sorts of undermining of Lebanon as well. These various countries, it almost seems as if the US policy is basically Israeli policy. It doesn't seem to be benefiting the United States at all. And if you look at the actual military strategies that have been being rolled out, around about, a couple of years after the 9/11 attacks, you had in 2005, you had the US Army General Thomas Barnett produced a world map, a blueprint for action, he called it, showing the non-integrating GAP countries. And if you have a look at this map, what you'll see is that the whole world is being divided by the Americans. I mean, it just sounds like a crazy plan, but this is what they've been doing. It is divided up into those who are allied to China and Russia and those who are allied to America. And the problem they see is the gap. These countries which are not 100% aligned to one or the other, and they're trying to force them to do so. But even more spectacular was in 2006, the US Armed Forces Journal published Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters' map of what he calls a balkanized new Middle East. Well, balkanized is my term, because this is the arrogance of the US and the Israelis, is that the US Pentagon is actually saying, well, actually, we're going to just redraw the boundaries of the Middle East, rather like the British did at the time of the First World War, because we're the new empire now, and we're going to actually change all these boundaries and use that in order to divide and rule the entire section of the world. Middle East is very, very important internationally, of course, because it's the boundary of Europe and Asia and Africa. So it's absolutely the key point in the world militarily, as well as, of course, as spiritually.
Okay, maybe if we can take a few seconds here for you, Richard Becker, to tell us what your book is all about, given the fact that we've introduced you as an author for Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire, because I think it would fit in somewhat with the context or the content of what we're talking about.
Well, it certainly does, because one of the kind of strands of Israeli foreign policy from 1948, and even really before 1948, Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of the State of Israel when it was founded in 1948, only viewed the UN partition plan as a stepping stone to acquiring greater territory. In 1949, just a year after the creation of the State of Israel, not on 55% of Palestine, of what had been the British mandated Palestine, but 78%, Moshe Dayan, then a young rising military officer and very close to Ben-Gurion, told a U.S. diplomat at a cocktail party, he said, our boundary is ridiculous. It must be on the Jordan. And that's been the objective ever since. At times, the United States and Israel had been at odds over this in the 1950s. And that was because the U.S. was trying to pursue a policy then of appealing to the neo-colonial leaders of Jordan and before the revolution in Egypt. And Israel refused at that time, and I think this is interesting, refused at that time a defense treaty with the United States. And the defense treaty with the United States was opposed by Ben-Gurion and everyone else except Moshe Sharet, the foreign minister, until he was ousted, because they felt it would limit their freedom of action to expand the state of Israel. Expansion has been on the agenda from the very beginning. And the aim has been to dislocate the Palestinian population, to drive the Palestinian population out of all of what had been historic Palestine. Also to seize parts of Lebanon and Syria. Part of Syria was annexed despite worldwide condemnation back in the early 1980s, the Golan Heights. The Israelis fully intended to stay in southern Lebanon, to possess Lebanon south of the Litani River until the resistance movement in Lebanon forced them to leave after 18 years back in 2000. Mm-hmm. So this desire for annexation and expansion has been integral to the Israeli state from its beginning and continues today.
Well, when it comes to the U.S., Tony Gosling, which you made some comments on the position of the U.S., based on the latest that's happened, 3 days of talks at the White House between what is said to be the aides of Donald Trump and Israel on whether to give Israel a green light at this point to go ahead with the annexation have ended without any final decision. Do you think that Israel is the only one leading the way here, or do you think that maybe the U.S., given the fact that it's Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner is the architect of the so-called deal of the century, in which the annexation has been introduced as part of it, maybe they are the ones who are also leading this, or is it a combined effort?
Well, look, it's a massive Israel lobby right throughout the West that's doing much of this. The United States House of Representatives and Congress, it's very difficult for these people to even get elected without signing up first to be supporters of Israel. One of the most pernicious angles on that is the Christian Zionists. They basically say, well, you know, it's your Christian duty to do this. Well, I'm a Christian, but I'm not a Zionist. And to me, the Zionist attitude is turning Christianity on its head. Rather like, you know, what the Knights Templar did back in the times of the Crusades. Very similar sort of approach. But no, I mean, I think the other big lobby that the Israelis have here in the West is the media. The mass media is extremely pro-Israel. In fact, they dodge any issues which are to do with criticism of Israel. For example, over this George Floyd killing, we've just had a front bench Labour spokesperson, Rebecca Long Bailey, one of the leadership candidates for our main opposition party, removed from the front bench on the idea that Israeli troops have been training American police, or Israeli police have been training American police. Now, she was sacked for saying that. And this is just a complete failure of the media to even admit that Amnesty themselves are complaining. Amnesty International, you know, the human rights organization, are complaining because the Israeli police have been training the American police. Yet when someone dares to utter it in Britain, they are sacked from the opposition front bench, as Rebecca Long Bailey was by Keir Starmer. And this is the most powerful lobby, I think, for the Israelis, is the media, because they believe they can get away with stuff and there will simply be no criticism. But they can't get away with this annexation in international law. International law is very clear. Annexation and territorial conquest are forbidden. They're illegal. They're crimes under the Charter of the United Nations. And this is not me saying this. This is according to Michael Link, who is the UN independent expert on human rights in the Palestinian territories. So there's a very clear message going out around the world that if Israel does decide to do this, this is completely flying in the face of international law. But in a way, the most scary, for me, the most frightening side of all of this is it looks as if the European Union is also going to go along with this flagrant violation of international law, which shows to me that the European Union is nothing more than just a little poodle for the United States and a little poodle for Israel for many years. You know, the people say, well, at least the EU is there to counter what the United States is doing. No, sorry, they're not interested in doing that at all. And I think what we've seen over the years is a kind of good cop, bad cop approach, with the European Union being the good cop and the United States being the bad cop. But actually, at the end of the day, they're working together.
Do you agree with that, Richard Brecker?
Yeah, I totally agree with it. I mean, I think there's a lot of popular opposition in Europe. There were many protests that took place in France and over these on Saturday, and there are many others that are taking place. But you know, we can see this. It's not just the British government, which has tried over the years to align itself as closely as possible, and this has been for decades now, with the United States. Whatever the United States was doing, they want in on the wars because, you know, the British corporations and the arms makers and so forth will get their benefits too. But it goes to the other countries of the EU. They don't really care. The rulers of these countries don't really care. They're trying to protect their interests in the Middle East. But they'll make some statements, and they won't. I don't believe that they'll really do much more than that. And this is the policy that has continued, and particularly at this time when there are other crises in the world, the leaders of France and Germany, Belgium, Italy, you know, they're all, Britain, of course, they're all going to look at, you know, what their interests, and they're going to judge that their interest in relation to the United States are more important than their relationship with, you know, if they have one at all, with the Palestinian people or in defense of Palestinian rights or anything like that. But there's no question at all. All of this is what Israel is doing. If it was done by a country that was on hostile terms with the United States, we'd be seeing every day the reports of the fascist settlers attacking, beating, killing, with the support of the Israeli army there in the West Bank, carrying out these attacks on the Palestinian people, condemnation of the fact that there's more than 5,000 Palestinian prisoners prisons inside the state of Israel. That's a violation of international law. It's forbidden for an occupying power to transfer the citizens, the occupied citizens, inside their own borders. It goes on and on. The annexations are illegal. The treatment of the Palestinians, gross violations of human rights. And this goes on continually, and yet it gets very, very little publicity in the mainstream, the corporate media in the United States.
Looking at some of the statements, however, Tony Gosling, coming from the EU, one might think that perhaps they were mulling these sanctions and were very serious about it. Going back a few weeks, the EU saying that, you know, sanctions could be a possibility. The German foreign minister even stated that. And just days ago, when there was an emergency session held between the UN member states on the annexation, I think it was the French ambassador that said, you know, sanctions might be a possibility. And isn't it the EU that can actually exercise this if they wanted to? Because as it stands, EU is Israel's #1 trading partner.
Okay, look, what we've got here is we've got a bit of a competition of interest, haven't we, between national governments in the EU and the EU itself. What happens is the EU effectively controls that foreign policy. It controls trade policy and finance policy in the Euro countries as well. So these individual foreign ministers can bang their fists on the table all they want. Ultimately, there won't be any real change unless the whole of the EU changes and makes a decision. So that's one of the most important things to understand here, is the EU is basically trumping, if I can use that word. In fact, in a way, it's a Trumpian move they're making, isn't it? Doing what the United States wants. They can trump the wishes of individual countries. And that's one of the reasons the EU was set up, by the way. Henry Kissinger, back in the 1970s, I think it was, maybe even, yeah, the 70s, said he's fed up with phoning up all these different countries, 25 different countries to get them all to agree. He'd much rather have one phone call to make. And he's got his dream now, hasn't he? With only one foreign minister for the whole of the EU. But look, let's be really clear about one thing. The European public and the American public do not support this. This is just literally the consolidation of power over the years into a tiny number of hands, and those hands are effectively not doing what ordinary people want at all. Look at, for example, the amount of trust there is in the British media. There was a report out last week which Reuters and various other agencies circulated. Fascinating that Britain is one of the worst countries in the world for trust in the media, which is a bit ironic since my programme was just pulled off the air here in good old Bristol with using the pandemic as an excuse, which I've been doing every week for the last 12 years. And it's not surprising that people don't trust the media. It's because voices like mine just simply don't get heard in the West. So it's 28% of members of the public in Britain actually trust what they see on the news, which is an all-time low and one of the worst in the world. So don't blame the ordinary people. This is the elites. This is not necessarily even individual governments. It's things like the European Union and the mass media that are trying to bamboozle people into these ridiculous decisions to support these racist and actually criminal international law policies, which echo actually the moves made by Nazi Germany in the 1930s, annexing Czechoslovakia, invading the Sudetenland, these sorts of things, obviously afterwards invading Poland and starting the Second World War. Eventually, this will almost inevitably lead to war until the Israelis are taught a lesson.
Well, leading to war is one thing. Michelle Bachelet has said, Richard Becker, that this is going to be very disastrous for the Palestinians, even for Israel itself, and for the wider region. So if Israel does go ahead, what type of disastrous consequences can we see happen if you agree with what Michelle Bachelet has said?
Well, in the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, the part that is proposed, virtually all of it, to be annexed to the state of Israel, I think produces half the agriculture in the West Bank. If the annexation plan for the Jordan Valley and for the settlement blocks goes through, what is left of Palestinian land, and it's virtually like this now, are tiny pieces of territory, non-contiguous, unlike any other state in the world. The only thing it resembles that I know of where the Bantu stands, the little pieces of barren earth that were designated by the South African apartheid regime as the expression of self-determination for the African people. That's what is left for the Palestinians. Of course, it will all depend on the struggle. It will all depend on what happens, what comes after that, if in fact they do go through with it. I don't think we can say for certain that it's happening, but it certainly, gives every appearance of that.
Thank you. We're going to have to unfortunately end it there. Let me thank our correspondent who spoke to us from occupied Ramallah at the top of the debate. Also, thank you, Tony Gosling, investigative journalist and author of Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire, Richard Becker from San Francisco. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the debate. From me, the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.